Part 3. 3 girls, 3 bullets. O wayfarer! Rest your head on the stony cobblestone, it is a foreign land, not the city of your kings. Chapter 16. The Valley of Sorrows. It all seemed like a bad dream. We had been away from our valley for almost 3 months, and as we drove back past Churchill's Picket, past the ancient ruins on the hill and the giant Buddhist stupa, we saw the wide Swat River and my father began to weep. Swat seemed to be under complete military control. The vehicle we were in even had to pass through an explosives check before we could head up the Malakand Pass. Once we got over the other side and down into the valley, it seemed there were army checkpoints everywhere and soldiers had made nests for their machine guns on so many of the rooftops. As we drove through villages, we saw buildings in ruins and burned out vehicles. It made me think of old war movies or the video games my brother Kushal loves to play. When we reached Mingora, we were shocked. The army and Taliban had fought street to street, and almost every wall was pockmarked with bullet holes. There was the rubble of blown-up buildings which the Taliban had used as hideouts, and piles of wreckage, twisted metal and smashed-up signs. Most of the shops had heavy metal shutters, those that didn't had been looted. The city was silent and emptied of people and traffic as if a plague had descended. The strangest sight of all was the bus station. Usually it's a complete confusion of flying coaches and rickshaws, but now it was completely deserted. We even saw plants growing up through the cracks in the paving. We had never seen our city like this. At least there was no sign of the Taliban. It was July 24, 2009, a week after our Prime Minister had announced that the Taliban had been cleared out. He promised that the gas supply had been restored and that the banks were reopening, and called on the people of Swat to return. In the end, as many as half of its 1.8 million population had left our valley. From what we could see, most of them weren't convinced it was safe to return. As we drew close to home, we all fell silent, even my little brother, Atal the chatterbox. Our home was near Circuit House, the army headquarters, so we were worried it might have been destroyed in the shelling. We also heard that many homes had been looted. We held our breath as my father unlocked the gate. The first thing we saw was that in the 3 months we'd been away, the garden had become a jungle. My brothers immediately rushed off to check on their pet chickens. They came back crying. All that remained of the chickens was a pile of feathers and the bones of their small bodies entangled as if they had died in an embrace. They had starved to death. I felt so sad for my brothers, but I had to check on something of my own. To my joy, I found my school bag still packed with my books, and I gave thanks that my prayers had been answered and that they were safe. I took out my books one by one and just stared at them. Maths, physics, Urdu, English, Pashto, chemistry, biology, Islamiyat, Pakistan studies. Finally, I would be able to return to school without fear. Then I went and sat on my bed. I was overwhelmed. We were lucky our house had not been broken into. 4 or 5 of the houses on our street had been looted and TVs and gold jewelry had been taken. Safina's mother next door had deposited her gold in a bank vault for safekeeping, and even that had been looted. My father was anxious to check on the school. I went with him. We found that the building opposite the girls' school had been hit by a missile, but the school itself looked intact. For some reason my father's keys would not work, so we found a boy who climbed over the wall and opened it from the inside. We ran up the steps anticipating the worst. "Someone has been in here," my father said as soon as we entered the courtyard. There were cigarette stubs and empty food wrappers all over the floor. Chairs had been appended and the space was a mess. My father had taken down the Kushal school sign and left it in the courtyard. It was leaning against the wall and I screamed as we lifted it. Underneath were the rotting heads of goats. It looked like the remains of someone's dinner. Then we went into the classrooms. Anti-Taliban slogans were scrawled all over the walls. Someone had written "Army Zindabad, Long Live the Army," on a whiteboard in permanent marker. Now we knew who had been living there. One soldier had even written corny love poems in one of my classmates' diaries. Bullet casings littered the floor. The soldiers had made a hole in the wall through which you could see the city below. Maybe they had even shot at people through that hole. I felt sorry that our precious school had become a battlefield. While we were looking around, we heard someone banging on the door downstairs. "Don't open it, Malala," my father ordered. In his office, my father found a letter left by the army. It blamed citizens like us for allowing the Taliban to control Swat. "We have lost so many of the precious lives of our soldiers, and this is due to your negligence. Long live Pak Army," he read. "This is typical," he said. "We people of Swat were first seduced by the Taliban, then killed by them, and now blamed for them. Seduced, killed and blamed." In some ways the army did not seem very different to the militants. One of our neighbors told us he had even seen them leaving the bodies of dead Taliban in the streets for all to see. Now their helicopters flew in pairs overhead like big black buzzing insects, and when we walked home we stayed close to the walls so they wouldn't see us. We heard that thousands of people had been arrested, including boys as young as 8 who had been brainwashed to train for suicide bombing missions. The army was sending them to a special camp for jihadis to de-radicalize them. One of the people arrested was our old Urdu teacher, who had refused to teach girls and had instead gone to help Fazlullah's men collect and destroy CDs and DVDs. Fazlullah himself was still at large. The army had destroyed his headquarters in Imam Dari and then claimed to have him surrounded in the mountains of Piakar. Then they said he was badly injured and that they had his spokesman, Muslim Khan, in custody. Later the story changed, and they reported that Fazlullah had escaped into Afghanistan and was in the province of Kunar. Some people said that Fazlullah had been captured but that the army and the IC couldn't agree on what to do with him. The army had wanted to imprison him, but the intelligence service had prevailed and taken him to Bajaur so that he could slip across the border to Afghanistan. Muslim Khan and another commander called Mahmud seemed to be the only members of the Taliban leadership who were in custody, all the others were still free. As long as Fazlullah was still around, I was afraid the Taliban would regroup and return to power. I sometimes had nightmares, but at least his radio broadcasts had stopped. My father's friend Ahmad Shah called it a controlled peace, not a durable peace. But gradually people returned to the valley because Swat is beautiful, and we cannot bear to be away from it for long. Our school bell rang again for the first time on 1st of August. It was wonderful to hear that sound and run through the doorway and up the steps as we used to. I was overjoyed to see all my old friends. We had so many stories from our time as IDPs. Most of us had stayed with friends or family, but some had been in the camps. We knew we were lucky. Many children had to have their classes in tents because the Taliban had destroyed their schools. And one of my friends, Sundus, had lost her father, who had been killed in an explosion. It seemed like everyone knew I had written the BBC diary. Some thought my father had done it for me, but Madam Mariam, our principal, told them, "No. Malala is not just a good speaker but also a good writer." That summer there was only one topic of conversation in my class. Shiza Shahid, our friend from Islamabad, had finished her studies in Stanford and invited 27 girls from the Kushal school to spend a few days in the capital seeing the sights and taking part in workshops to help us get over the trauma of living under the Taliban. Those from my class were me, Maniba, Malka-e-Noor, Rida, Karishma, and Sundus, and we were chaperoned by my mother and Madam Mariam. We left for the capital on Independence Day, 14th of August, and traveled by bus, everyone brimming with excitement. Most of the girls had only ever left the valley when we became IDPs. This was different and very much like the holidays we read about in novels. We stayed in a guest house and did lots of workshops on how to tell our stories so people outside would know what was going on in our valley and help us. Right from the first session I think Shiza was surprised how strong-willed and vocal we all were. "It's a room full of Malalas," she told my father. We also had fun doing things like going to the park and listening to music, which might seem ordinary for most people but which in Swat had become acts of political protest. And we saw the sights. We visited the Faisal Mosque at the base of the Margalla hills, which was built by the Saudis for millions of rupees. It is huge and white and looks like a shimmering tent suspended between minarets. We went on our first ever visit to the theater to see an English play called Tom, Dick and Harry and had art classes. We ate at restaurants and had our first visit to a McDonald's. There were lots of firsts, although I had to miss a meal in a Chinese restaurant because I was on a TV show called Capital Talk. To this day I still haven't got to try duck pancakes. Islamabad was totally different to Swat. It was as different for us as Islamabad is to New York. Shiza introduced us to women who were lawyers and doctors and also activists, which showed us that women could do important jobs yet still keep their culture and traditions. We saw women in the streets without purdah, their heads completely uncovered. I stopped wearing my shawl over my head in some of the meetings, thinking I had become a modern girl. Later I realized that simply having your head uncovered isn't what makes you modern. We were there 1 week and predictably Maniba and I quarreled. She saw me gossiping with a girl in the year above and told me, "Now you are with Resham, and I am with Rita." Shiza wanted to introduce us to influential people. In our country, of course, this often means the military. One of our meetings was with Major General Attar Abbas, the chief spokesman for the army and its head of public relations. We drove to Islamabad's twin city of Rawalpindi to see him in his office. Our eyes widened when we saw that the army headquarters was so much neater than the rest of the city, with perfect green lawns and blossoming flowers. Even the trees were all the same size with the trunks painted white to exactly halfway up. We didn't know why. Inside the HQ we saw offices with banks of televisions, men monitoring every channel, and one officer showed my father a thick file of cuttings which contained every mention of the army in that day's papers. He was amazed. The army seemed much more effective at PR than our politicians. We were taken into a hall to wait for the general. On the walls were photographs of all our army chiefs, the most powerful men in our country, including dictators like Musharraf and Scary Zia. A servant with white gloves brought us tea and biscuits and small meat samosas that melted in our mouths. When General Abbas came in, we all stood up. He began by telling us about the military operation in Swat, which he presented as a victory. He said 128 soldiers and 1,600 terrorists had been killed in the operation. After he finished, we could ask questions. We had been told to prepare questions in advance and I had made a list of 7 or 8. Shiza had laughed and said he wouldn't be able to answer so many. I sat in the front row and was the first to be called on. I asked, 2 or 3 months ago you told us Fazlullah and his deputy were shot and injured, and then you said they were in Swat and sometimes you say they're in Afghanistan. How did they get there? If you have so much information, why can't you catch them? His reply went on for about 10 to 15 minutes and I couldn't work out what his answer was. Then I asked about Reconstruction. The army must do something for the future of the valley, not just focus on the military operation, I said. Maniba asked something similar. Who will reconstruct all these buildings and schools? She wanted to know. The general replied in a very military way. After the operation, first we will have recovery, then rehabilitation, then hold and transfer to civil authorities. All of us girls made it clear that we wanted to see the Taliban brought to justice, but we weren't very convinced this would happen. Afterwards, General Abbas gave some of us his visiting card and told us to contact him if we ever needed anything. On the last day we all had to give a speech at the Islamabad Club about our experiences in the valley under Taliban rule. When Maniba spoke she couldn't control her tears. Soon everyone was weeping. We had enjoyed a glimpse of a different life in Islamabad. In my speech I told the audience that until I had watched the English play I had no idea there were so many talented people in Pakistan. Now we realize we don't need to watch Indian movies, I joked. We'd had a wonderful time, and when we got back to Swat I felt so hopeful about the future I planted a mango seed in the garden during Ramadan as they are a favorite fruit to eat after breaking the fast. But my father had a big problem. While we had been IDPs and for all the months the school had been closed he had collected no fees, but the teachers still expected to be paid. Altogether that would be over 1 million rupees. All the private schools were in the same boat. One school gave its teachers salaries for a month, but most didn't know what to do as they couldn't afford to pay. The teachers at the Kashal school demanded something. They had their own expenses, and one of them, Miss Hera, was about to get married and had been relying on her salary to help pay for the ceremony. My father was in a fix. Then we remembered General Abbas and his visiting card. It was because of the army operation to expel the Taliban that we had all had to leave and found ourselves in this situation now. So Madam Mariam and I wrote an email to General Abbas explaining the situation. He was very kind and sent us 1,100,000 rupees so my father could pay everyone 3 months back pay. The teachers were so happy. Most had never received so much money at once. Miss Hera called my father in tears, grateful that her wedding could go ahead as planned. This didn't mean we went easy on the army. We were very unhappy about the army's failure to capture the Taliban leadership, and my father and I continued to give lots of interviews. We were often joined by my father's friend Zahid Khan, a fellow member of the Swat Qawmi Jirga. He was also the president of the All Swat Hotels Association, so he was particularly eager for life to go back to normal so that tourists could return. Like my father, he was very outspoken and had been threatened too. One night in November 2009 he had had a very narrow escape. Zahid Khan was returning to his home from a meeting with army officials at Circuit House late at night when he was ambushed. Fortunately, many of his family live in the same area, and they exchanged fire with the attackers, forcing them to flee. Then on December 1, 2009 there was a suicide attack on a well-known local ANP politician and member of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Assembly, Dr. Somsher Ali Khan. He had been greeting friends and constituents for Eid at his hujra, just a mile from Imam Dari where Fazlullah's headquarters had been, when the bomb went off. Dr. Somsher had been an outspoken critic of the Taliban. He died on the spot and 9 other people were injured. People said the bomber was about 18 years old. The police found his legs and other parts of his body. A couple of weeks after that our school was asked to take part in the District Child Assembly SWAT, which had been set up by the charity UNICEF and by the Kulkor, My Home, Foundation for Orphans. 60 students from all over SWAT had been chosen as members. They were mostly boys, although 11 girls from my school went along. The first meeting was in a hall with lots of politicians and activists. We held an election for speaker and I won. It was strange to stand up there on the stage and have people address me as Madam Speaker, but it felt good to have our voices heard. The assembly was elected for a year and we met almost every month. We passed 9 resolutions calling for an end to child labor and asking for help to send the disabled and street children to school, as well as for the reconstruction of all the schools destroyed by the Taliban. Once the resolutions were agreed, they were sent to officials and a handful were even acted on. Maniba, Aisha and I also started learning about journalism from a British organization called the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, which ran a project called Open Minds Pakistan. It was fun learning how to report issues properly. I had become interested in journalism after seeing how my own words could make a difference and also from watching the Ugly Betty DVDs about life at an American magazine. This was a bit different. When we wrote about subjects close to our hearts, these were topics like extremism and the Taliban rather than clothes and hairstyles. All too soon it was another year of exams. I beat Malka-e-Noor for first place again, although it was close. Our headmistress had tried to persuade her to be a school prefect, but she said she couldn't do anything that might distract her from her studies. "You should be more like Malala and do other things," said Madam Mariam. "It's just as important as your education. Work isn't everything." But I couldn't blame her. She really wanted to please her parents, particularly her mother. It wasn't the same SWAT as before, maybe it never would be, but it was returning to normal. Even some of the dancers of Banner Bazaar had moved back, although they were mostly making DVDs to sell, rather than performing live. We enjoyed peace festivals with music and dancing, unheard of under the Taliban. My father organized one of the festivals in Margalla and invited those who had hosted the IDPs in the lower districts as a thank you. There was music all night long,